Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us for this session, Deep Decarbonisation. Now, we're in the fishbowl, so you're in the right spot, because you've probably got above and below views, and you don't have to put up with the backs of our seats. So this is a nice spot. And we've got what I would call like an intimate gathering here. So we have some other colleagues, I think, that are coming soon, and if you have any friends, please bring them along. We're competing with 6 or 7 other sessions. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us. Now, deep decarbonisation, we've probably heard a little bit about it today. You know what we have to do. We all know what we have to do. And I think the political will is there. And we're certainly, the narrative is there, but unfortunately, we're not moving as fast as we might want to go ahead with this. So we have an expert panel here in place today, and let me just quickly introduce you to them. We will be joined by Marianne Laigneau. She is the Group Senior Executive and Vice President on the International Division of EDF, of course, the French electric company. Joining her also Brad Page, the CEO of the Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. Thank you so much, Brad, for being with us. Dr. Rainer Seele, he is the CEO of OMV, the Austrian energy company, chemical company, you can define it where you want, but one of the key players in the energy sector without a doubt. And Rodney John Allam joins us as well. He's a partner with 8 Rivers Capital and the 2012 Global Energy Prize laureate. So between the 4 of them, we've got some different perspectives here and some very interesting ones. And what I would also like you to do is please feel free, I'll give you a signal maybe about halfway, to join our conversation. So be thinking about what they're talking about, if you agree, if you disagree, if you have something perhaps that we haven't thought about, and maybe add some value to it as well. But we will have some time for questions, and we will look forward to engaging with you and making sure that we do have a strong dialogue here, and hopefully everybody will take something very good away from this. Marianne, if I may start with you, because I suppose you're in that space where we're comfortable, what we know and love. We all use electricity, we're all familiar with it, and I know you're a tremendous proponent in terms of where we're going to go with it. But when we think about deep decarbonisation, I mean, is this the right language? Is this where we're going? Is it a reality, or is it actually that grand dream that we all hope to get to one day?
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for this question, Eithne. I think you put the right question. I mean, where are we standing? Obviously, I think most of us read the last UN panel report on climate change, issuing that if we are doing nothing or standing on the same path, by the end of this century, temperature will rise by 3 or 4 degrees. And we all know the consequences of this frightening and worrying news in terms of flooding, in terms of access for population to energy and water. So what is the link with energy? That's your question. It's very simple. The energy generation is, and the production, generation and consumption represent the major part, let's say 80%, of the CO2 emission due to humanity, to human activities. So to answer your question, and I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting debate, we need to reduce this CO2 footprint. We need to fight global warming by using more and more electricity in the energy mix, both on the generation side and the consumption side. And from my point of view, but it would be at the heart of our debate, it's not only about technology. I mean, there's not only one solution. We need to combine different energy mixed solutions and situations. It's most of all about politics, and we need, first of all, adapted regulations from governments in order to help private or public players to fight against this global warming. For example, we should have a higher carbon price in order to send a right signal for investment in our energy sector. And we should address also the question of how we can combine growth for societies, for economies, sustainability and energy, in order not to oppose them. That's why there are different paths for different energy transition, considering where is our starting point.
But when we look, Brad, and I want you to address this, we look at energy demand, and according to the International Agency, we looked at it grow by 2.3% last year. So energy demand is growing. The narrative is very familiar to every one of us. I think without a doubt, you know, we're talking about the energy transition. All of the oil companies are on board. Everybody wants to do better. The political will is there, but actually it's not working because emissions are actually rising. So would you say that actually we need a complete shift perhaps in maybe our thinking, and just when we look at the new sort of energy economy, what do we need to do to actually make it work? Because it has to. We have to almost come back and make this work.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And I think that this is actually what's at the heart of the deep decarbonisation story. I think what we get confused constantly with is that on the one hand we talk about a desired temperature outcome which has a parts per million attached to that, generally somewhere between 350 and 450. And we talk about carbon reduction. And then when I look at the policies the government's put in place, they swing straight around and talk about renewables and renewables and renewables. Now don't get me wrong, electricity is one of the biggest parts of the solution to this challenge, but it is not the only one. What we're actually missing is a holistic approach to how we're going to deeply decarbonise. One big chunk is electricity, but electricity doesn't solve some of your high heat needs in many industrial applications, and we've got a whole different set of questions there. In fact, we've got about 25% of the globe's emissions coming out of these industrial processes that by and large are not going to be solved by electricity. So we actually need to be thinking about how do we produce in large scale affordable hydrogen that is clean? How are we actually going to address the inevitable overrun in emissions that means we're going to have to be drawing emissions from the air? And one of the issues that I have with this is that we don't have a technology neutral or an all of the above approach. We have very selective policies that are actually not serving us to draw down those emissions. And just to go to your opening point, I think the thing that is constantly forgotten is that if I go back to the start of my career, and now this is embarrassing to tell you that it's 40 years ago, but 40 years ago, fossil fuels were about 85% of total primary energy demand. And in those 40 years, energy demand has grown something like by 100%, factor of 2, and it's still close to 85% of total primary energy demand is fossil fuels. So focusing solely on renewable energy is not going to get us to where we need to be. We need a much bigger approach to this. We need all technologies in here, and we've got to be paying a lot more attention to sectors beyond electricity. So I'm not saying to the exclusion, in fact we're not doing enough in electricity, but we're forgetting about everything else.
Okay, and I'll come back and we'll get a lot more detail on that from you. Dr. Seele, just when we look at, and I would imagine you agree with Brad in terms of broadening this out a bit, but you know, it's not as black and white when we come to electricity being the big solution. And really, talk to me about where chemistry plays a role on this. And again, we have to live with CO2. I mean, it's... You have your wonderful theory on this, so I just want you to explore it a little bit more for me.
Yes, thank you, Eithne. Well, very often in these discussions I see that people are afraid about CO2. As a chemist, I can tell you, this is not a dangerous molecule, especially if you make chemistry. Yeah? You breathe CO2, you can drink it if you have sparkling water, so the molecule is really not dangerous to us. It is the concentration. And it is a very, very nice starting material. And we are now investing more and more research activities into the CO2 chemistry. And I think we, especially, Brad, I agree with you, we need to have also industrial solution that we can reduce our CO2 emissions in our industrial processes. One thing is I can make chemistry. The other thing is that I can go for carbon capture storage. That's, I think, the biggest opportunity we have, and we need to have the regulatory right framework, especially in Europe, for this. And the chemistry I'm thinking about is that we are going to hydrogenate the CO2 molecule. And this is just driven like a chemical cycle. You know, if you burn natural gas, you're producing CO2, and if you catch the CO2 and you let it reacting with the hydrogen molecule, you can either produce methanol or you can produce the methane molecule again. So don't be afraid about the CO2, we can make chemistry out of it. The main question is why the industry hasn't developed these technologies over the years, and it's all about money. It's just not meeting the economics, and that's the reason why we haven't invested into the development of these technologies. It doesn't pay off. And if we don't have the right regulatory framework that we can invest and develop these technologies, then I can give you lots of lectures in chemistry, but we wouldn't apply it. So we have to find a solution in the solutions in the economics, and then the industry will come out with new innovations which are very helpful to reduce our CO2 emissions.
And I know you've got a few projects on board yourself at the moment that might not be quite ready for commercialization. We'll talk a little bit about that. But were the economics right, you'd probably deliver it tomorrow. Would you? You would.
Yes, I think what I would urge is that especially when the new innovation, technological innovations you would like to commercialize, you need to have a financial catalyst. And if I see how much energy taxation is already in the market and how much income the government has from energy taxes, I don't know why this is not flowing back into the industry just to support and catalyze that we are going to meet the right economics in hydrogenation of, for example, CO2.
Save that catalyst thought for us, and only a chemist would talk about financial catalysts, wouldn't they? Hold it for us, I like this one. Rodney, when we look at it, obviously, you know, energy producers, and we look at the great demand that's out there, you know, the role is to supply power and supply energy to populations. And indeed, we've got new populations coming on board that deserve energy as well. But do we actually have a choice here in terms of, you know, do we provide energy at any cost and reduce emissions, or do we just provide energy and maybe we have to think different about reducing emissions?
Well, the message I can give to you is that there are processes now being actually demonstrated which will potentially generate power at the same cost as the best technology that we have now based on fossil fuels, but with the added advantage of capturing the whole of the CO2 that's available when you combust a fossil fuel containing carbon. The first of these demonstration plants is actually built and is in startup in Houston in Texas. And that's based on the cycle which people have named after me, the Allam cycle. But it's basically using CO2 as the working fluid in a power system and burning the natural gas or coal-derived gas with pure oxygen, so that you actually don't have to separate the CO2. It naturally comes out at the end of the process as one of the byproducts of combustion in a system which can only eject CO2 and water because those are the only products of combustion. And the second area that we're working on, and I'm particularly working on, is hydrogen production on a very large scale and with extremely high efficiency. Now, what we have to remember is, just as other speakers have mentioned, power generation is only one of the major problems in terms of the consumption of fossil fuels and the emission of carbon. We've talked about power generation, but think of transportation. In America, the amount of CO2 that's being emitted in vehicles is greater than the amount of CO2 emitted from all the power generation systems. Let's talk about industry now. That obviously, industrial processes are major emitters of carbon to the atmosphere. The worst of those is cement production, which is a vast emitter of carbon dioxide. There's no real processes that have been developed up to now for positively addressing cement manufacture. That would be a first pass in terms of the amounts of carbon that are being emitted. And let's forget that there's a major amount of CO2 emitted in the whole process of district heating and the heating of buildings, both commercial, both domestic, and industrial heating systems, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. So those are the 4 areas. They can be addressed by addressing carbon-free power, by addressing the hydrogen economy, which can replace the hydrocarbons that we're using in cars at the moment. Remember, electrical energy that you use in a battery-powered car has to be generated somewhere. So unless you generate that electricity and pay for the inefficiency that's there when you charge and discharge a battery, you're actually ending up emitting more CO2 than you would by simply not doing anything at all and just using hydrocarbons. I know it's something that has to be considered. Hydrogen transportation systems are basically the systems of the future.
I should just keep you on all my panels, Rodney, because I'm doing energy efficiency, mobility. So I should just roll you around with me for the next few days. You'll have an answer for everything for me. But again, huge amount of great insight in there. Now, but what I'm also hearing a little bit about, that it's about politics and money. And I think we're hearing this from all of you. You're upset about the tax regime and to the point where it should be spent better. Maybe I'll come back to that. But you also mentioned it too, Marianne, in terms of, the regulators, the political will that's there. What do you need to see happening?
I mean, I mentioned the carbon floor because we need signal in order to invest in plants that will run and operate for, let's say, the next 50 up to 100 years. When you're talking about nuclear, and nuclear is part also of the solution of a better energy mix, because without nuclear, I mean, the energy transition will be more and more costly, and the world will need to invest extra billions of money. It has been very much underlined by the last International Energy Agency report about energy mix, but specifically about nuclear. So we need clear signal from regulators. We need investment, of course, in renewables, as you mentioned, but also in base load, like nuclear, in energy efficiency, because you're right, it's about transportation and buildings and industrial processes. So there are ways, and EDF is working on that with clients, especially in the region, in order to optimize their industrial process to reduce their CO2 emission. And there's a lot of good solutions we can provide. You mentioned hydrogen. Hydrogen could be part of the solution. I do agree. For the time being, in the world, 95% of hydrogen, it's grey hydrogen, meaning produced out of fossil fuels. Only 5% of hydrogen is green. You have countries we want to help the development of hydrogen, like Germany, so they put in place subsidies, or Japan. But for the time being, as you mentioned, it's not in the money. The economics are not so good, so we need to believe in that. Utilities, industrials, governments, regulators, in order to help the development of green hydrogen for transportation and for buildings. So a panel of solutions, and it's based also on each company's commitments. I could mention the company I'm working for, EDF, who is not only a French company, but an international utility, and we are very active in the region. Our CO2 emissions are quite low because of the weight of nuclear in our energy mix. Nevertheless, we committed ourselves to divide that by two in the next 20 years.
And I'd like to talk to you a little bit more in detail, but I want to stay with this politics and money just for a minute, because obviously politics and money is very much associated with, the old economy and with what kept oil and gas thriving. But in many ways, you're all saying that politics and money is what's preventing the new energy landscape from actually, getting started in many ways. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah,
A little bit.
You are, and I'd like to actually take this on another step, because I think every time that we talk about politics and money, and therefore policies, and the next S word comes along called subsidies, and then governments run away and say cost, and everybody gets terribly excited about it, and that, I think, sends us into a spiral. I think there's a great call to arms here for governments. I think that what we need to be creating is the new energy economy, and that new energy economy is actually the only story into the future for growth. It's the only story. It's the only story for high-paying, high-quality jobs. It's the only story about how we actually value the planet and that we get returns that often, and I'm guilty of this as an economist, that often economists are not fully accounting for. So I think one of the ways that we have to present the policy discussion is differently, is to start talking not solely about the benefit to the climate, but we need to be talking about how we're going to get much better access to affordable, clean energy for those who don't have it. That we're going to transition the OECD countries to a place that actually sets the example and proves the technologies. That we're going to transition and have a just transition for the disaffected workers in many of the areas that if you were anti-fossil fuels, you would simply close them down. But if you switch that around and think about the sunk cost infrastructure and the opportunity to repurpose existing facilities that then transitions workers into, for example, production of hydrogen with CCS from coal, then suddenly we don't strand the assets, we actually turn them into a clean product. And I think this discussion with governments needs to be much more about the broad economic benefits that come from this and the avoidance of cost in leaving whole communities with no future. We actually need to think about this differently.
When we look at governments around the world too, but again, I suppose it's the hazard of politics. They're in power for a few years and then they're going to move on. And it's often, I think, some might be accused of self-interest rather than the wider and greater good. But the one thing that hasn't changed is, as you would say, that tax on energy, and it gets steeper in many countries. We never hear of too much tax relief when it comes to gasoline or when it comes to anything. But how would you propose that actually maybe that tax is better spent? And again, it's maybe about the awareness to people, because I think they don't realize the amount of tax they pay at the moment.
I think we have to be very careful that we are discussing now additional taxation. Yeah? Especially in Europe, we do have the debate that we should go for CO2 taxation, and that people do believe they need to have an additional tax that they consume less energy. Especially if we end people, and if this is really a taxation we trigger on CO2, and if people are now spending more money into the state budget, and we don't see a reduction of CO2 emissions, I think your lifetime as a government is rather limited, because that's the kind of a deal. We all pay higher taxes than the prices we pay for the energy to produce it. The oil, the gas, it doesn't matter. So if you stop at a gasoline station, 2/3 of the price you pay is already taxes. And now I have to ask the question, if you would like to collect additional taxes, why haven't you used the income tax from energy for many, many decades to work on solutions that we do have lower CO2 emissions? Don't take me wrong, I think we need to have a system where CO2 needs to have a certain price level. But if you go for a taxation, then you will burn the pocket of the people with a low income. And the social application is a real problem if we talk about cost of energy. So what is my solution? I think the politicians, they should come up with a commitment with the industry. We haven't seen that commitment of the industry. The Paris Protocol was signed by politics, not by any businessman, not from the industry. And there hasn't been any commitment between the industry and the governments. It's only a CO2 target, and if you don't meet that target, you will get a penalty. That's why the automotive industry is now switching. I think that's not the kind of cooperation if we would like to really have big breakthroughs. I would like the governments that they make that money fresh for the industry, and that we have a commitment that the industry is investing this additional money, and that we are committing on a certain CO2 emission reduction. That's a kind of a deal.
As an industry, do you feel that you're sort of knocking at a locked door or a blocked door? I mean, is that conversation going on? Or because, you know, the nature of governments is that it is so fluid and it moves that you're talking to, and you look at maybe a country like the UK, you're talking to probably a different government every so often, maybe within a year.
Well, I don't know, is that for me?
No, but just quickly, I mean, is that just
Well,
the nature, just a quick
No,
comment on that?
what I do see is that
Is the
very
dialogue
often...
happening?
Well, the dialogue is happening, but it's not based on facts. The problem we have nowadays, especially as we do have political campaigns and elections, that it's totally emotionalized. Yeah, it's just hunting for voters, and now we have a beauty passion going on. Who is CO2 neutral first, and that's the winner of a race. And I think that's a little bit short-sighted.
Rodney, and just taking on from that too, when we look at public opinion at the moment, it really is saying that, you know, it's the end of fossil fuels, that any day now it's all going to be over. When we look at what's going to replace it, does it absolutely have to go when we look, or can we live with it? Is there, and some of the chemistry is what you talk about too, and you know, the Allam cycle and various other ways, can we actually live with both?
You can live with both, no question. In fact, if you don't accept that fossil fuels will remain as the major source of our energy in the next few decades, then there will be a pretty big catastrophe. If any real measures were taken to forbid fossil fuels, which people have even talked about, that would be totally impossible. We couldn't sustain the world's energy needs without fossil fuels. So we have to look to our objective of fossil fuel use with 100% CO2 capture. That's our objective. And as a secondary objective, we have to make sure that the technology we develop can generate the energy that we need for, say, transportation and power, which are the two biggest users, at no increase in cost over what's been up to now best technology costs. That's our objective. And I think there's a very good chance we can achieve that. But it's going to require the same sort of actions from politicians as actually we used in the UK. You subsidize a particular technology by allowing the first people to have a power guarantee cost, for example, which completely covers their cost and profits. And then you drive the cost down by continuing those subsidies. And the result in terms of wind power in the UK is when the first subsidies were put in, they were around £15 sterling for a megawatt hour of energy. And now they're down to 5 or 6. So they've been cut by a factor of 3, which is quite amazing. And that's the way you introduce new technology. You give an incentive to the people who are going to introduce it, and you allow the costs to come down as they develop the technology. You have faith in the people who are going to produce the goods, and they will produce the results that you need.
And I'll carry on that technology discussion in just a minute. But one thing I'm also hearing about, and you talk about cement industry, and we're talking about the big industry polluters. Now, Marianne, when we look at electricity, you know, can it be the answer? We can, I think, all very, very clearly see how, for the consumer, electricity is the sort of no-brainer. We're looking at electric cars, we're looking at, you know, the electrification of our houses, the Internet of Things, all of that. But talk to me about big industry. Yeah. And what can electricity do to make sure that big industry is lowering emissions? And can electricity save big industry?
I hope so. So thank you for asking. And maybe I'd like to come back on coal and what have been said before by Brad especially, and I totally agreed on that, meaning that you may know that a lot of, let's say, majority of European countries decided to exit coal. So they ask utilities to close their coal-fired plants in a certain range of time. This has to be prepared. I mean, you can't say to an industry, well, just close your coal plants tomorrow because we need to meet the Paris Agreement targets. On the EDF side, we prepared that decision during 10 years in order, first of all, to training, to convert our people, to help them to find other type of jobs, and secondly, to try and find some other industrial solutions for our plants. For example, you can convert them in biomass generation using wastes of wood, which is on the site. Because it's about job and employments and communities and territories. When you are telling them, they said, oh, what are we going to do? And the second example about coal, it's at the, let's say, international level. Because now, most of the international, worldwide financing institutions, I will not name them, but it's easy to recognize them, are saying coal is bad, coal is evil. So we will not put $1, €1 in coal greenfield project. Okay, great, but will they help all these countries who have cheap and competitive coal to exit coal and to replace them by other type of technologies without harming jobs, employment, growth, and local development? That's the type of global picture we need to phrase in order to find the right solutions through subsidies, through taxation, through financing, through investment. Coming to electricity, yes, when we are looking again at the International Energy Agency report and figures, they said that in the, let's say, coming 20 years, energy rise in consumption, it will rise by 40% in the coming 10 years, exactly the same amount of rise that oil took in the past 25 years. So energy will have a greater part of electricity, and that's why we need to invest in renewables, but also in nuclear, as I must say, and also you need to invest on the demand side, not only on the generation side, but on the client side, in order to provide them with accurate energy efficiency solutions through their industrial processes, like we are doing in the region and in other countries. So there are a lot of innovative, let's say, global solutions we can provide. You can put on the side, industrial side, some wind machine in order to produce electricity through wind, solar panel. Then the client will ask you to think about a mini grid on the site. And you can master and help him to decrease his energy consumption. So it's about global solution through digitalization as well. And we must not forget the grids, because when you're talking about energy or electricity, especially when you have more and more renewables coming, you need to include them, integrate them in the grid. And it raised a lot of questions for the grids. That's why we need also to work on smart metering, smart grids, to have a grid more resilient in order to be able to combine, let's say, classical generation solutions and more renewable, more decentralized solution. So I do believe that we need to focus also on the grid, and that's why in the region they are issuing tender offers for smart meters in this country, but also in KSA.
Many people would argue that the grid is nowhere near ready, and with the concept we look ahead, and if everybody buys electric cars tomorrow and plugs them all in, we are in trouble. And then it comes back to politics, because the grid is not ready, because the regulation is not giving the go-ahead and the guarantee to the electric companies.
Yeah, I mean, the
So
electric mobility...
When are we going to get out of this cycle?
Yeah, but I mean, electric mobility will be also a new way of storage, because you can use your car. Imagine that the numbers of electric cars is increasing, and it will, for sure. We are not so sure about the path, the rhythm, but it will increase. And then you can use your car as a way of storage, and you can give again the electricity at night, for example, to the grid. But it's different type of grid. Yeah, we are there already in some prototypes, in some countries, in some regions.
come back to, and just you raised this as well, and I'm hearing it a little bit, I think if we were to ask, sort of a general population, what is one of their biggest worries at the moment, and people talk about climate change and reducing emissions and all of that, and it comes down to, shutting down power stations. And I mean, there is a global movement and a global narrative that would love to see all this happen, and probably a big anti-capitalist movement in terms of industry and all of that. So the danger is, if we solve one of the ills of society, as in cutting emissions by pulling back on industry, we will probably create an even bigger society ill. Now, you have an example whereby that almost happened. Talk to us a little bit about what was the solution, particularly with your power plant.
Sure. So, thankfully, not my power plant,
not
but but my example, I'll grant you. Indeed. So, I think it's very interesting to see the regulatory arrangements in Canada, which say, in shorthand, any coal-fired power plant that's 50 years old must meet an emission standard that's equivalent, roughly speaking, to what a combined cycle gas turbine would turn out. There's very few standard coal plants can achieve that. The expectation was that would simply see the coal plants shut. Coal plants shut, and lots of workers are out of work, including mine workers, and there's nothing to replace it. Usually in that location, because whatever replaces it is somewhere else. And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't require quite the same skills. Now, the world's first carbon capture and storage facility on a coal-fired power plant actually is operating in a little place called Estevan in Saskatchewan. And somebody other than me in this room may well have been there, but let me assure you, it is so flat out there that you drive for 2.5 hours, and I am convinced you can see the curvature of the Earth. And there is nothing between Regina, the capital, and Estevan. There is not a town to be seen. And when you get to Estevan, here's a little town, and there's a coal mine, and there's a power plant. That power plant would have shut several years ago, except that it got carbon capture and storage. It now meets, in fact exceeds, by a very long way, the actual emission standard. And so now what we've actually achieved is continued baseload power. We've achieved a much lower emission outcome. The CO2 is also sold for enhanced oil recovery as well as straight geological storage. And the workers at that plant still have a job and are going to continue to have that job because the plant's now refurbished and is probably good for another 30 to 40 years. That's the sort of sunk cost infrastructure we need to look at.
Reduction.
Oh, absolutely. It captures 90% of the CO2 emissions. So it's now a very low emission coal-fired power plant. It's had its issues. It was first of a kind. But the real point is that power plant's refurbished, it's operating, and that community now calls for CCS on other power plants there because that saved them from extinction.
Talk to me, Rodney, too, about CCS and also the Allam cycle and that, and continue this conversation here. Because CCS is not a new process, and it's been around for quite a while, and it's been stops and starts, and there's been support for it, and there's not support. So, Rodney, if you can, I'll bring you in on this too, because...
Well, carbon capture and storage, let's look at what happens in America. There's over 20 million tons a year of CO2 injected in America into oil formations for enhanced oil recovery. This is a form of carbon capture and storage because basically about 80% of the CO2 you inject stays permanently underground, and there are means of recycling the CO2 back into the oil structure. And of course, the other demonstrations that have been made, the most important is the one in the North Sea from Statoil, which has been going now for about 20 years, into the water-filled porous geological structure underground, which is called the Utsira Formation. And that has been a completely successful injection project of over 1 million tons a year. And that's been very carefully monitored. And the actual plume of CO2 is very confined. There's been a huge amount of geological data obtained from those demonstrations. So the storage part is well established and proven. The transportation is simple pipeline transportation. And as I've mentioned, there are power generation and hydrogen generation systems under development and under demonstration at the moment, which will achieve 100% CO2 capture. So the future is we can use fossil fuels very effectively, and we have to recognize that these power stations have a long life. So as the power stations come to the end of their useful lives, the option is to shut them down and replace them with carbon capture power stations, which can use the same fuels. There's no need for us to abandon coal. Coal is going to be used in places like China and Southeast Asia and India, whether we like it or not. So we better make sure that the technology is available to use coal in a clean manner, so that when these stations are shut down, we can convert them in an efficient manner and continue to use the fuel which is available to us.
But, just follow on quickly on this, you say, and coming from a scientific background on this too, that this is the way to go. What about safety? What about public opinion that without a doubt is driving policy, and it's driving the governments at the moment in terms of decisions, and really making them wake up and forcing them to maybe ignore the science sometimes, sadly?
Well, obviously people say, well, if you can put it underground, it could come back up again, and that's true. But in the 20 or 30 years of experience in America in enhanced oil recovery, there's been no major accidents of any kind. The current technology for oil well safety and drilling is completely applicable when you inject CO2. And you can be sure that if you inject it, for example, into a formation which has been depleted of natural gas, the natural gas was there for tens of millions of years and never leaked out. So you can be pretty sure that the CO2 you're injecting will be okay. And just one small chemical point, it often forms an impervious cap by reaction with rocks which overlay these structures. So there's almost a permanent sealing mechanism which can go on. It's a very sound method of getting rid of the CO2.
And I see that the two scientists here in agreement with each other. One thing I'd also like to do, and please, if you have a question, just let us know. But before we do take a question, I believe we have somebody with a microphone who can do that. As a major company, what are you actually doing when you're looking at new ways to look at decarbonization and new projects? And again, what can we do that's different? Because we have to look, as what we've heard, at the variety of processes. And you can please stay with the carbon capture if you want to comment on that as well.
I think we would like to capture more the value out of oil. We will switch more from fuels into petrochemicals, and it's very well accepted. Very often I have that dialogue that people are asking us to run out of oil. You don't have your aspirin tomorrow, and you don't have the antibiotics anymore. You don't have all that materials. We wouldn't have that chair and the carpet. And I think there is an acceptance, and I think we need these products even more, that we should invest into it. And if we are honest in that debate, there are some fuel products where we don't have a technological substitution right now. If I talk to the airline industry, it doesn't matter. They are telling me the last drop of oil which will be consumed is our industry. And definitely we don't have any technological innovation that you can run an A380 with something else than our premium jet fuel. It's great stuff, and it will continue to be. So we have to switch from our product line more into these long-lasting products we need as an energy source. The same is with the shipping industry. If you think that in a storm out of the ocean you can maneuver a ship with batteries, sorry, it doesn't work.
There.
And they miss
could
an
have done it both.
opportunity, and we should move into natural gas, and the impact is enormous. We are talking about substantial CO2 reduction potential, and we don't need to move into electricity because you can't drive that, and you don't have any refuel of batteries on the ocean. And especially I think that this debate has to be more in the political arena, because you don't see the chimney when the ship is out of the ocean, out at the ocean, and that's why these CO2 emissions are not in the discussion going on. When it comes to electricity, I also have a clear message. If we don't bring costs down for renewables, the impact will be limited. Because very often I hear that fantasy story, we can make all that solutions and it will work. What I do see, especially as a debate in Germany going on with a high share of renewables, the industry can't cover the costs anymore. We do have the second highest energy cost on our planet, and the country is risking their global competitiveness if we don't get competitive pricing with renewables. We can't continue a system where Germany is paying more than 25 billion euros each year that we are going to produce that stuff. It has to be competitive on a standalone basis. And if we do have lower energy cost, electricity cost, the impact will be much, much stronger than today when we are discussing it. Because we are only discussing it because we want to get rid of CO2 emissions, and we forget that we are in a tough competition globally.
Thank you for that. We have a few questions that are coming here. Do I have a microphone from our dear people? Sean, please introduce who you are.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sean Evers, Managing Partner of Gulf Intelligence. I'd like to ask the panel how they plan to take advantage of 2020, the year in which the Paris Climate Agreement goes live or comes into legal force, how each of your individual institutions or companies plan to take advantage of this particular moment, or how they intend to use it to advance some of these ideas.
Marianne, perhaps tell us what you're doing at EDF.
Yeah, I mean, it's not about, thank you for the question. I'm not sure it's about taking advantage of the Paris Agreement. I mean,
yes.
As we all
just a
debated.
Second. Sean, maybe it twisted another way for us.
You know, I do think it is an opportunity,
yes,
ultimately, to take advantage. I do use that word intentionally in the sense that, you know, it's like Dubai hosting Expo 2020. They take advantage of that moment in order to advance their global brand and their commitment to technology or whatever the messaging might be. It seems there's a lot of responsibility on government to take initiative with Paris climate, when really industry and other institutions, I think personally, should be seeking the moment as an opportunity to leverage, to take advantage of a moment.
Okay.
But they should be leading up to it. You should be ready for it. Go ahead.
I do understand your wording, but I think it's about our global responsibility. I mean, sustainable growth requires sustainable energy. And as I mentioned, that's why EDF, as a global utility and player, decided, even if our CO2 emission is very low due to nuclear, but we decided nevertheless to commit ourselves to reduce our CO2 emission, to divide them by 2 in the coming 15 years. We commit ourselves to double our renewable generation and to move up to 50 gigawatts. As you mentioned, and I would like to answer on that as well, we need also to think of the countries with no access to electricity or to energy. I mean, 1.1 billion people in the world, especially in Africa and also in Southeast Asia, have no access to electricity. So for them, it's not about carbon capture or CO2 price. It's a lot more basic. It's about education, health, job, employment, and future. And that's why we need to provide them a solution to them. And it could be both centralized, but green. I would mention we invest in EDF invest in a 1.2 billion euros hydro dam in Cameroon, and when it will be commissioned, it will represent 30% of the energy demand and needs of this country. We need to invest in decentralized solution as well, and people will have access through solar home system panels with prepayments on their mobile phone. So you are taking directly to the next technological step, and that's why we are deploying these solutions in many, many African countries and having more than half million of customers. So it's really our responsibility, and I think each utility has that in heart and in mind, that they are part of the solutions. They have a global responsibility. They need to commit themselves with true and accurate figures, not stand about greenwashing, saying, yes, we are the best and we are doing things, we are fixing. We need to commit on figures. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And in order for public opinion to measure the progress we are really making.
As a company, what's OMV doing?
Well, first of all, we have to contribute to the target. Although I haven't signed it, I repeat myself, there hasn't been an agreement between the governments who has committed to the target and the industry. But from my point of view, I just look back in 2020. My country, Austria, has committed to a 16% CO2 reduction target. OMV, if I look back, we have now 11%. So I have to manage until the end of next year 5%. And I will do my job. And then I'm fully compliant. And I do hope that I'm going to be a good example also for other companies in the country.
Rodney, your company, I suppose, can't do too much in terms of like taking advantage, as you said, but what can you do with your clients, with the people that you influence, with the organizations and companies that you deal with? What would you advise them?
I would hope that by the end of 2020, we'll have the first order for a large commercial CO2 cycle power system with 100% CO2 capture. And I will hope that that comes in the UK, and we're working, the pair of us, towards that objective. The government also, I'd like to see bring into law their intention to go to zero CO2 emission by 2050. I think those two actions would speak volumes to the objective that we've got to look at in general for mankind if we're going to solve this problem in the foreseeable future. So those are the two things I'd like to see, and I think they're both achievable.
Brad?
So my institute's a bit different. We are not lobbyists. We actually have governments as members as well as large multinational corporations, but we do believe we're now regarded as trusted advisors. The observation I'd make about the Paris Agreement is that the Paris Agreement is actually nothing without individual government, national government policies. And so the real life to that Paris Agreement comes from what every individual government does. And based on their NDCs today, we're headed for about 3.5 degrees. So the real observation that has to be made about the Paris Agreement coming into force is that it's terrific and it is a huge achievement, but we are so far away from getting onto the course that the Paris Agreement seeks that actually what we need is governments working with industry, because that's where the capital is, to actually generate a whole new energy economy. And this is transformational. This is bigger than I think most people have vaguely begun to understand. And if the IPCC is right, and I've no reason to doubt them, the time frame is shortening for making that transformation. So I think the point we'll be making in 2020 is this is terrific, but it's actually the start, and we have so much more to do that we've got to get a whole lot more inventive than we've been to date. And we've got to be seeing this in the broad and the breadth of the benefit it brings, and stop focusing, and I don't mean industry focusing, I mean governments stepping away from policy action that they say is, quote, too expensive. We need to think through policy in a much more sophisticated manner. So that's really our message around it. And of course I'll be saying that CCS must feature in that, because it's not going to be the predominant feature of abatement, but without it, it's almost impossible.
You want to come back in on this,
No,
Marianne, please?
We need to be pragmatical and realistic. You mentioned Germany, and if we are looking at the energy transition in Germany, which was a huge political shift, the level of CO2 emission of Germany today is the same that it was in the 90s. Nevertheless, the tremendous amount of money it costs to the citizen and to the taxpayers, I can see that you agree with me. And why that? Because they invest a lot in renewables, but when there's no wind and no sun, you need baseload. And what is the German baseload? It's coal and lignite.
That's right.
Okay, so prices for industrial customers, 30% higher than in France. Cost for taxpayer, huge and tremendous. So, I mean, let's look at the facts and the figures and no ideology. So it's a range of solutions. It's not about one technology. It's a mix of solutions, and it should be adapted to each country transition and situation.
So it's coming back again to politics and money, I guess.
I'm not a politician, but I just would like to open up a different window as well. I can't agree more, especially if people are paying money to reduce the CO2 footprint and nothing is happening, then they are challenging the government. And that's why I think Fridays for Future is doing a great job, that they are challenging the government, that they commit to the targets. So what I also would like to do is just to make everybody thinking a little bit, what is my own contribution? What I do see in that debate very often is that people would like to delegate the problem to politicians and the industry. The industry is guilty and the politicians are guilty. But if I look what is the commitment of the society, that you are running your daily life very efficient in energy consumption, I only can see that people are complaining but not moving out of their comfort zone. They don't want to reduce the living standard. And they say, okay, I want to keep it, and the politician should solve it that we have less CO2 emissions. And if we are looking in the mirror and if we are honest to each other, it doesn't work in such a combination. If people are not being aware that they also have to contribute to a CO2 reduction, then it wouldn't work, because they are creating the market. And I said that very clearly. People are complaining, why? Because I'm selling gasoline and diesel, and they say, I am the one who is making bad with the climate. No. If there wouldn't be the market, we wouldn't produce that stuff. And the consumers are producing CO2.
I mean, that's a bit simplistic too, but I mean, you know, and I don't want you to be out there with your placards, you know, on the street at the moment, but you are going to still fly, and, you know, industry still has to happen. And I think on that level, we have to find that balance that still allows industry to continue and, you know, international relations, so to speak, to continue, and you to come here to Abu Dhabi to see us and us to come to Vienna to see you and vice versa. But again, there's other ways to actually cut.
Well, I can't agree more. Don't take me wrong. I only
You're not
say
going with the placard yet.
It starts with everybody.
Yes,
it starts with everybody. It's not only that the industry has to contribute and the politicians, every human being has to contribute to that target.
Rodney, talk to me about energy efficiency, and we'll get a microphone to you, sir, in just a moment. Stay with energy efficiency, particularly when it comes to industry. How can industry be more efficient? And when we look at almost the waste of energy, we have another question over here in a moment. When Rodney
I'd like to just briefly say that one of the most important things now is to look at individual industries, such as oil refining, petrochemical production, specifically different processes such as propylene, ethylene. Look at each of these industries and work out what's the best future method of eliminating carbon emissions. Now, I can remember 10, 12 years ago, we did that for BP for the Grangemouth oil refinery, and we showed them what would happen and what their costs would be if they were to reduce the emissions from that refinery by 90%. And it was perfectly feasible and could have been implemented. But of course, it would have put price onto a barrel of oil. And it brings you back to the point that it's not possible for individual countries to make these sort of decisions. What we're looking at is an international arrangement which allows these things to be made in different countries which have different needs, and there has to be some sort of cross-subsidy some sort of way in which subsidies can go from one place to another so that we maintain more or less a competitive environment in the world at whole. But we subsidize some countries which are rich in resources, both intellectual property and actual resources of energy, can transport that into a common pool. Can you imagine that happening with all the international problems we have at the moment? I mean, it's a bit of a long ask. So we have to try and understand that with international political situations as they exist, this sort of global approach is going to be very, very difficult. People have talked about smart grids, but they've talked about grids which extend over the globe so that we could make a huge amount of solar power in areas like Abu Dhabi and the Sahara and use that on a global basis so that there was no night and day problem with solar power. It could be transmuted everywhere. The Australians have done a lot of work in this area. And there are things like that which need intense international cooperation. So I think that's the next step forward.
And in terms of energy efficiency, I'm coming to you, sir. I am. Just stay quickly on this one. You know, the energy company, utilities can actually do a lot to educate and to really push this one forward. Again, in terms of pricing and baseload and peak demand times and all of that. What are you doing at EDF to make sure that energy efficiency is, you want to sell electricity, but at the same time you need them to be efficient?
I mean, we are courageously saying that the better electricity is the electricity we are not selling. I mean, so we are encouraging our clients to save and to reduce their energy consumption, and there are a lot of ways to do that by adapting the prices to the conditions of the generation, and to encourage them to use and to use energy when it's cheaper to generate, by working with our industrial clients. That could be car manufacturers, that can be petrochemical industry. They are using a lot of electricity to reduce their consumption by improving their processes, and it's mid-term investment. So for the first level, we can help them to save, let's say, 10% of their billings through very simple digital tools. We are implementing one in KSA for Kingdom Tower. We open that desk. It's just no investment required. And then you are discussing with the clients in order to discuss about investment to go further on reducing their bills. Though there are a lot we can do, and we are doing through, let's say, digitalization, and through a constant and permanent dialogue with our clients. Could be industrials, that could be individual clients, and there's a lot to be done,
We will, sorry, take your question, because we've only got about 7 minutes left, please.
Yeah, my name is Johan van der Westhuizen. I'm a director for DuPont here in Abu Dhabi. I think I'm also South African, and I think the example that jumps to mind is, you know, about a year, 18 months ago, one of the cities in South Africa nearly ran out of water, if you know that, Cape Town. So I think for me, you know, you could see that it was almost too late before people started changing their habits and their culture and their behaviors. And I think all of you are touching on the point, but it sounds like we are still trying to find an engineering solution when we're not doing enough on the culture and on the education. And I think we've seen in Europe, and the examples that you give, is that, you know, you have a predominantly educated society, the culture is quite mature, you can do quite a lot on kind of reducing the environmental footprint, getting an understanding for energy efficiency. But what about those countries where there's a lot of pollution going on, where the education is not that high, where the governments are not functioning, where you can't even monitor the environmental footprint? I mean, I would be interested to just get your views around that. I mean, you mentioned you are supplying some technology to Africa. I think OMV operates in many of those countries as well. But just your view around, shouldn't we do more around the cultural piece, around getting the next generations more aware of what they can do?
Thank you, and this could be our question that we're closing off on. So, Rodney, what can we do in the short term? And again, running out of water, London had power cuts, you know, all of these things are happening, and I suppose at the minute they're warning signs to us.
I think It's a very difficult question. And, you know, if there was an easy answer, we'd be doing it now. People are doing as much as they possibly can, but I think gatherings like this bring together the experts rather than the people we're trying to convince. So there has to be a lot more attention to actually just talking to people in your own environment. I've just given lectures to local groups, you know, 20, 30, 50 people on what the possibilities are in the future. And if all of us just did that in our own environments, we'd make a big step forward. In terms of what is really going to catch people's attention, it's, for example, examples of really important technical breakthroughs which change the lives of people. Now, in Africa, think of the breakthroughs that happened when the simple cell phone came in. I mean, that changed people's lives. There's no people in any place in the world who don't understand what a good standard of living means. And yet, if we went back 50 years, half the world didn't know what a good standard of living was because they'd never had any experience of seeing the West. Now, everybody wants the same things that we want. So we've converted the world into a consumer society with those little handheld devices that we use for everyday communication. And that's one of the unseen consequences of change in technology. Maybe when we bring in hydrogen-powered cars, we'll realize that we can plug the car into our local house and dispense with the electricity grid for most of our electricity. That's a real possibility which will change the way in which electricity distribution occurs and electricity use occurs. So there are these unforeseen consequences. But I think we have to really concentrate on trying to teach people what the problems are and what the possible solutions are. There's been too much gloom and doom and not enough optimism about what the future brings. And this conference is Energy for Prosperity. And I think, as people have said, there's a huge prosperous future for us if we can start to implement these changes.
And we will do our best to find that great optimism. But a lot of what you're talking about, absolutely, the huge demand that is going to come and is beginning to come. And we have to look at, you know, maybe even the UN goals when they're looking at places in Africa to possibly by 2030 have 60% energy access in a country like Uganda. What do we tell the other 40% of people there? That this is as good as it gets? You know, and they're going to have to wait maybe another 20, 30 years. So there is a big social shift, I think, that's going to change in terms of energy demand. This will be sort of wrapped up, and this is a lovely question. Thank you to sort of help us wrap up this conversation as well. What can we do, and again, what do you do in this as well to make sure that the companies are doing their bit?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it's about discussing with local communities and involving them in this energy transition by finding the right solution for them. And you mentioned South Africa, and of course they are short of water, but they are also short of electricity these days and these months. And EDF is working with ESCOM and other utilities in South Africa for a very, very long time. So it's going through, let's say, technical cooperation on nuclear, on plants, but also trying to find solutions through hydroelectricity dams, through solar home systems, and we have a lot of clients in this country. I was mentioning our greenfield project in Cameroon called Nartigal. I mean, it took us 5 years to discuss with local people in order to involve them in our project. It's not only EDF project, it's the local communities and region project, villages, head of villages, association of environment, NGOs, and so on. So we need to have these comprehensive ways of addressing problems in order to build common solutions and win-win solutions. I mean, I am convinced it is possible. It is possible in Africa. It is possible in Southeast Asia to bring and to sell electricity. Why are these peoples? They are eating through charcoal, which is costly and very dangerous. So it's about their health, their education, their access to water, to electricity, to a better life, to a better future. That's why we are so passionate about energy, because it is about a brighter future.
And again, it is this concept of, access to energy for all, and people deserve it. Of course they do. We can't pull anybody back. We've only got a few minutes on this, wrap it up, and because I've got to do the next panel, I can't be the one that lets this one run over. I'll be in trouble. But again, what do we need to do, and what can we do? And, because we've got to do it quickly. I'm also hearing that. We can't delay too much.
Well, I actually think we need to change the narrative fundamentally. I think that we've got ourselves to a place where it's fear, doom and gloom, and people don't actually react terribly well to that, and increasingly talking about we need to be on a war footing and things like this might be the basis of how you need to respond, but it is not the basis of the way to motivate. And I think we've got to move to a place where we are motivating for reasons that are personal. And one of the things about the climate is it's not very personal. It's not like a tax cut, which is very personal. So we need to be showing people where the benefit is to them. And the more that we can do that, the more there will be tolerance and acceptance of a whole host of policy measures, rather than saying we've got to do this, otherwise we all burn in hell or something. Because frankly, there's enough politicians running around saying, actually, that won't be right because the scientists are all loopy. Yes. We've got to move this narrative to a different place.
I'm going to leave you the closing word on this one for me now, so make it good.
All right. I think we shouldn't talk too much, we should act.
Yes.
That's the first. I think people would like to see results. And the first my industry can contribute is, let's stop flaring. I was thinking about my operations in Libya. If you fly over Libya overnight, it's like a daylight because we are flaring so much. That's number two. Then let's go for gas, because gas is short-term the cleanest fuel where we can keep the system alive and we can reduce short-term immediately the reductions. Then don't give CO2 certificates for free. Just renovate the trading system. The next point I said, set realistic targets so that we shouldn't disappoint the people in the countries, and don't calm down the next generation by setting targets of 2050 when none of us is going to take the responsibility. And I think we should not discuss too much in extreme positions. Our planet is not black and white. It's very beautiful and colorful, and we should go for something in the middle. Thank you.
So we need more creative solutions in terms of actually getting to where we need to go. And again, as you say, that need and that absolute desire, and I think from what the wider population wants, it needs to see industry actually doing stuff. But you're also right, I think, so much that whole narrative has to shift. It has to change because it's very much one-sided at the moment, and I think it's very tough for the industry to actually rise up and say we are doing something when nobody in a way wants to listen to it. So we really have to see these projects, these big projects, come on board and actually see some significant results. And again, wave that flag very proudly when they happen. I think many times the industry can be accused of maybe not taking or not showing the great work that they do. Because the narrative has really ran away from them, I think, at the moment. It's something I'm also sort of hearing here. We have to claim that. I don't know if we've ever had it in terms of the industry, but it also has to be talking about this transition, I think, that we have to live through, and we all have to see it through, and we have to come through it, healthy and happy, and hopefully there's a creative and a more beautiful outcome at the end of it. That's ultimately what we need. So we haven't given you the answers in this. We're going to be discussing a lot in the next few days, and we're not necessarily going to have the answers, but I hope it gives you some thought that you're going to take away from this and perhaps carry this discussion through. Our next panel here is going to be talking about mobility, which of course will continue this discussion on emissions and what are we doing about it, and how particularly transportation and mobility will feed into that and hopefully be part of the solution as we look towards a greener, cleaner future for everybody. Thank you all so much to my dear panel. Thank you all for joining me, and thank you for your involvement as well.